Hi everyone, welcome to the Teaching Nonviolent Atonement live chat. We are doing things a little bit differently today, starting off in Q&A mode. Hi Matthew, how are you? Oh, see, this is the thing. Everybody in Q&A mode starts off as muted, and thank you for Matthew for providing us a great example of this. I feel actually rather mythical in muting everybody right at the beginning, and for Girardians, you know this is not a very good thing. But that's okay. We've had some issues in the past with interference and bad audio, and the people at Pathos think that this is going to help us out. So, there goes Matthew. So if you have a question or comment at any point during the presentation today, you can unmute yourself, and I think you'll have to hit the cam button up on top, and then you can bring yourself video and audio into the conversation and ask Michael a question, which brings me to our presenter today, Michael Hardin. Actually, before we get to Michael, a few more housekeeping things. I just want to give you an update on October. Next week, we will be talking with our friend Paul Nectarline about the lectionary text from the Girardian lectionary. On October 17th, we'll have an open chat with just me and Suzanne about a topic to be determined. If there's a topic that you'd like to discuss, let us know. And then on October 24th, we'll be talking with David Dawson about his book, Flesh Becomes Word, a lexicography of the scapegoat, or the history of an idea. So it's a fascinating book. Again, you don't have to read it to have the conversation with David, but I recommend it. It's a great book. So that's what we have coming up. But today we have Michael Hardin, who has the second edition of his book, The Jesus-Driven Life, which is out right now, isn't it, Michael?
It'll be out, available on Amazon, book form, Kindle form on Monday, October 7th.
Excellent. Monday, October 7th. And I want to point out that we had some video issues with Michael. He's up in Canada on a tour, preaching and teaching tour. And so Michael is joining us by phone. Michael, how are things up in Canada?
Cold. I'm in Edmonton, and it's cold.
Yeah, yeah. Are they treating you well up there?
Oh, man, absolutely phenomenal. The hosting here is incredible. The hospitality is grade A+.
Awesome. Excellent. Michael, do you want to tell us anything about the updates to the Jesus-Driven Life, or should we just get straight to your presentation?
Oh, no, I'm happy to self-promote.
Okay, go for it.
Well, the new Jesus-Driven Life I'm really quite excited about because it actually feels like a real book for the first time. I've added 70 pages of material. There is a chapter on Hebrews in it now, and there's a chapter on Revelation that Brad Jerzak wrote for the book. And a lot of new material, and particularly in the Girard chapter, in chapter 5, I've added a whole bunch of new material outlining my theory of the authority of Scripture from the Girardian perspective. So we're really pleased with it, and we're offering it for 1 week, beginning October 7th, on Amazon at half price, which is going to be about $18.95. After that, it's going to go to full price.
Excellent. Which, with my math, would be around $40.
Yeah, 38.
38. Nice. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I became a pastor because I'm not very good at math. So there you go. Excellent. Well, I want to remind people I've muted everyone, which, again, is very mythical of me to do. And in Girardian terms, that's bad. So feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a question throughout Michael's presentation, and you can bring yourself into the chat. We do have, Michael has put together an excellent PowerPoint presentation for us today.
Now, Adam, that's not quite true.
Okay.
You're the one that took my 90 slides from my 5 talks and put this together.
Well, I did do a little bit of work. I did do a little bit of work. Thank you for giving me a little bit of credit for that. That's nice of you. I will bring up the PowerPoint and share that with everyone. And if you have a question that you want to type or a comment, I've told Michael that we are a very talkative group. And if you have anything that you want to say, feel free to just bring yourself on in. Okay? Alrighty, here we go.
Lovely. So just so you are all aware of how this particular presentation came about, I have 5 one-hour talks that I do that each have a PowerPoint presentation. And Adam went through those 5, which are about 100 slides like this, and picked out the ones he wanted me to talk about, and then he put them in this particular order, so I had to go figure out where he was going in this. And then I did a dry run of it last night here in Edmonton. So we're going to talk this morning about nonviolent atonement. What I have to do, and because I know that all of you are well-versed in Girard, is I would normally deconstruct the default position, the penal substitution position of Anselm and Calvin, and I would spend a whole hour deconstructing that, which I'm not going to do here today. We're just going to jump right into it. So Adam, if you'll put up slide number 2. And you'll see that what we're really dealing with here has to do with changing the direction of the way we think. And so I love this slide. I love the matrix metaphor where Morpheus says to Neo, this is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. That, for me, really encapsulates what happens when you begin to look at Christian doctrine through the lens of mimetic theory. Once you take the pill, and you all know this, once you read Girard, there is no turning back. Next slide. And so there's a picture of Neo, of course, taking the red pill, which we've all done. And what happens now, next slide please, Adam,
Got it.
is that it causes everything to be rethought. And this has really been my project, is to ask how to think through Protestant theology and all of its significant doctrines in light of mimetic theory. I think in one sense I'm trying to do for Protestants what I see James Allison trying to do for Catholics. And so, of course, we begin with René's theory of sacrifice. Are we dealing here with exchange theories or self-giving? What is this business of sacrifice? And of course, René himself will change his mind on the use of the term sacrifice over the course of his career, from this notion of sacrifice as taking the life of the other to accepting the notion of self-sacrifice, or my preferential term, self-giving. What is sin? I mean, in the entire Protestant paradigm, sin has to do with breaking of the law, but in mimetic theory, sin has to do with destroying relationships because we're interindividual. How should we understand humanity or our anthropology? Do we do it in terms of the Enlightenment and that we're autonomous, or do we in fact begin to see that we are our relationships? How should we understand the death of Jesus in terms of the Calvinist penal substitution paradigm? Or what my preference is to combine the Christus Victor theory and Abelard's moral influence theory. Because with Christus Victor, what I'm able to do is deal with all the questions around negative mimesis, and with the Abelardian theory, which I'll talk about more here later on, I can deal with positive mimesis.
Can you say a little bit about Christus Victor?
Yeah, Christus Victor is the view of the early church for the first 11 centuries, namely that on the cross, Jesus defeats the devil and death. And so Jesus conquers these powers and principalities. That's the primary emphasis of Christus Victor. I take that further, read it from a Girardian perspective in terms of the Satan, and understand the deconstruction of negative mimesis to also be occurring on the cross, as well as an example of positive mimesis at the same time. So the cross for me functions as the fulcrum for all theological thought.
Nice, the theology of the cross.
Yeah. So, is reconciliation retributive or restorative? How shall we understand Scripture? We just need a new view of Scripture. Sola Scriptura no longer works because the polyphonic character of the voices in Scripture. And all of you, I'm sure, have seen my little chart on the forgiving victim that I actually came up with back in 1988. And it was finally put into diagram form for me by Richard Beck. But I'll tell you, I discovered Girard in 87, and already in 1988, things were laid out for me. I don't want to use the word revelation, but you all know the experience of when you start rethinking these things. It's an absolutely mind-blowing experience to take that red pill and jump down the rabbit hole. So, of course, we have more different doctrines to look at. Let's go to the next slide, Adam, number 5. I'm told that this audience is hardcore Girardian, so I don't need to spend time doing the mimetic theory with you. Adam, I believe you created this slide. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I think you did, because I don't recognize it. Yeah, I'm going to steal it now, Adam.
Excellent. I like it. Michael, we have 2 questions in the chat.
Okay.
One is
I'm
from
looking
Matthew.
at the power.
One is from
What's
Matthew. One question is from Matthew.
Okay.
Matthew says, you mentioned Catholic and Protestant. How do you see Orthodox fitting in?
Yeah. That's a great question. I'm not an Orthodox scholar by any stretch of the imagination, although I know a few in Canada. I would say that the Orthodox Church has predominantly used the lens of the Christus Victor paradigm in their atonement theory, particularly the version that one finds in Irenaeus of Jesus as the true human who undoes all the destruction of the first human, the Adam. And so, yeah, Orthodox thinking is very important. And Suella Gerber, your best bet for the chart, if you're looking for it, is either to friend me on Facebook, you can do that, or you can go to my website, preachingpeace.org, and go to articles and essays. Look for my article titled, Go to, look for the little essay called Reading the Bible from a Peacemaking Perspective. It's in there.
When I post the archive of the chat, I'll link to that site on Preaching people. So great.
So here's the thing: if we're actually talking about atonement theory, and Mark Heim has so thoroughly deconstructed this in the most beautiful manner in his book Saved from Sacrifice, in terms of a critique, a breakdown of the penal substitution theory, and then arguing for the scapegoat emphasis. One thing that doesn't happen in a lot of mimetic theories, we don't do positive mimesis. And the reason we don't do positive mimesis is because Renee didn't do a lot of it. Renee's anthropology is focused on negative mimesis up to and including the cross, and he makes very clear at the end of I See Satan that he is not going to do anything other than scientific anthropology. And so positive mimesis belongs to the resurrection. It's the resurrected Jesus that allows us to see the positive mimesis in the cross. So we are in the process of rehabilitating Abelard's moral influence theory. And if you go to the next slide, Adam, there's a wonderful essay by Laurent Schultz, The Rehabilitation of Abelard. And he's talking about all the scientific developments in the cognitive sciences. And he says that these scientific developments, especially the increasing significance of empathy and social neuroscience and of emotion and moral psychology, can help mitigate the most common objections to this type of theory, that is Abelard's theory, by reinforcing the plausibility of a metaphysically robust and causally forceful model of exemplarity. In other words, Jesus on the cross not only deconstructs negative mimesis in his overcoming of the satanic impulse to violence, and we see this particularly in the Gethsemane narrative, but also is an example of positive mimesis in his forgiveness of his persecutors as the forgiving victim. So when we look at these new trends that are developing in the neurosciences, we can actually, in addition to all the stuff about mirror neurons that has become so popular amongst Girardians, we can engage these other sciences regarding emotion and empathy and have an incredible, extraordinary, robust view of positive mimesis. So if we go to the next slide, this is something you're... I'm sorry?
Well, I was going to ask you to say a little bit more about the Garden of Gethsemane, because we put a lot of point on Jesus on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But not a lot on the Garden of Gethsemane. So could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. When we talk about the death of Jesus, we are dealing with a narrative that begins in a garden. And it's the whole narrative from garden to death, to last breath, that constitutes the Passion narrative. I mean, scholars have made this pretty clear that the opening of the Passion narrative is the Garden of Gethsemane scene. And so in that scene, you have Jesus renouncing the real possibility of the test to use force or violence. I believe it's in the Synoptics where Jesus says, don't you understand I could start a holy war with 10,000 legions of angels? And so there's that resistance at that incredible point to not take this path. And it's that choice then for nonviolence, to heal the one who's struck by Peter's sword, to heal his ear. It's that choice to not retaliate. It's that choice to take this path that he doesn't want to take, but takes anyway, all the way to this ultimate expression in Luke 23 of, Abba, forgive them. They just don't know what they're doing. That becomes a huge paradigm for seeing now in narrative form how this plays out in terms of positive mimesis and in terms of the deconstruction of negative mimesis. So the next slide is just a quote from that wonderful book that Scott Garrels edited, Mimesis in Science. You're all familiar with mirror neurons and the social psychological work that's been done by Andrew Metzloff. We are hardwired to imitate others. And the problem has to do with our cultural software. It's got a virus in it, and that virus is violence as the solution to itself. So it's the software that needs to change, not the hardware. Next slide, Adam, vindicating Girard. Again, I don't need to tell you how much it's been so helpful for all of us to know since the early 1990s that so many of the human sciences and now some of the physical sciences are in fact vindicating Renee's incredible insights back in the late 50s and early 60s. And as Renee notes, in 1979, now of course things are going to be different here, 24 years later, but in 34 years later, in 1979, Renee says when you look at the literature on imitation, you discover that acquisition or appropriating is not part of that. And of course, he traces that to Plato and Plato's influence. And so we live in this remarkable time where right now we're beginning to see the importance of grasping when it comes to desire and how that leads, of course, to rivalry and undifferentiation and then the scapegoat mechanism. So what we now need is a way to be able to talk about the death of Jesus or atonement, the whole Passion narrative. We need to be able to talk about this from Gethsemane to the final breath in terms of how this plays out in our life. And this is the real problem of penal substitution. If in penal substitution or that exchange theory of the atonement, the death of Jesus 2,000 years ago was a transaction between Jesus and God. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. And all I have to do is believe in that paradigm to be saved. Well, of course, we all know that's just simply believing in the old archaic religious paradigm, and it doesn't save anything. It simply keeps the status quo going. And so the Christian life or discipleship is related to atonement only in the same sense that Jesus kept the law and was a perfect sacrifice to God on our behalf, so we too keep the law. Well, if we'll go to the next slide, my friend John Stoner raised a real key question. He said, if you have an atonement theology, and you take Jesus' words about taking up your cross seriously, then the fact is there's no room for avoiding this. And that is, discipleship is also about atonement. And in order to get handles on that, we have to understand that in this saying of Mark 8:34 and following, Jesus is not valorizing suffering. That is not what he's doing. He is saying that you must be ready as one of his followers to model the same forgiveness to the enemy other as he did on the cross. That's what atonement is about. And it has an extremely powerful relational or ethical component. So if we look at the next slide, we have another quote from my friend Laron Schultz, who says that most versions of the moral example theory depict Christ as a mediating salutary life in relation to God and neighbor by providing a model of loving moral agency that inspired imitation. The desire to emulate Jesus is evoked by the experience of the initiative of divine love, which is taken to be the origin, condition, and goal of this whole ministry. And I think that's a very important statement. In other words, just as revelation of negative mimesis comes as grace, so also revelation of positive mimesis comes as grace. It is not an orientation to life that is somehow taken up by do's and don'ts. The prohibitions, the myths, the rituals, these are all gone. Now we're talking about an orientation that one sees already displayed in the crucified Christ. And so on the next slide, slide number 11, Adam, one of the things I talked about in the Jesus-driven life was discipleship is this yoking. It's this relationality with Jesus. It is this intentional choice to take this yoke, and wherever Jesus turns, we turn. And I, live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and I was writing this, literally watching the oxen and the yoke in the Amish farm across the field. And I did talk to some farmers, and they say that when you have a young mule, you team them up with a veteran mule that's plowed the field for years, so the young mule learns the turns. And I think it's the same thing with us, too, in this sense. God doesn't turn us. God turns Jesus. We're in the yoke. We just naturally go with the flow. And in the next slide, what all this leads us to...
I want to ask a question about morals.
Morals?
Yeah.
I don't have any.
Good. Because I imagine this can be a stumbling block for people. If we say that Christianity is not about morals, then does anything go?
Well, let me ask you this.
Yes.
If you're yoked with Jesus, then anything goes. And Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So why worry? I mean, there's no worries in discipleship. It's not about, am I right or wrong? Is this right or wrong? I never ask that question.
What is
I'm
the
yoked
question?
with Jesus. The question is this right or wrong? Is this, good or bad? I don't ask that question. I just do my utmost to stay in this yoked relationship and discern in any given moment in any relationship how to be loving, nurturing, kind, gentle, patient, etc.
Gotcha. I dig it.
Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. And again, this nonviolent view of the atonement not only has an ethical component in it. It's not just about a transaction that took place. It's about a reality that's lived. Well, it also has an epistemological component. It changes the way we think. It not only changes what we think, but how we think. Because we learn in nonviolent atonement to think through life in terms of the lens of the forgiving victim. And that just changes everything. Because I think the hardest thing in the world is to forgive someone that hurts you. And one of the things I pointed out last night is we're always looking to blame somebody for something. They did this on purpose. That's how the satanic mechanism functions. The Satanist, the accusatory principle, says you did this on purpose. But on the cross, Jesus decoupled action and intention. He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And if you've ever had two children fight and one of them comes and they'll say to you, he hit me on purpose. Or if somebody does something to you once in a day, okay, and they say, I'm sorry, you forgive them. and they do it twice in a day, and they say, I'm sorry, and you go, yeah, well, okay. But by the third time, now you're going to say, you did it on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
We couple action and intention. Jesus decouples action and intention on the cross. And I think that's absolutely fundamental, an epistemological change in the way we see people now. So when people say or do unkind things to me, instead of coupling action and intention, I decouple them and recognize that whatever's happening in that relationship in the moment is not what they really want. So that's important, I think. And then the next slide, imitating Jesus is atonement. This comes from a beautiful essay by Per Grant before he went all heretical on us.
Oh.
No, I love Per. He's just a great guy. A little more critical of Rene than I'm fond of, but that's just my idolatry. So he says that the imitation of Christ is each individual's response to the process of dissolving violence and sacrifice. And in this respect, imitating Christ is the individual's contribution, or continuation, rather, of Christ's work. And I think you see that especially in the Pauline letters, where Paul says in Colossians, I'm filling up the lack in Christ's suffering. As the world still has a lot more violence to get out of its system. And I'm allowing myself to be one of those absorbers of that. And, you know, so nonviolent atonement has to do with reality. It's not just about some theory. That's why I don't like to say nonviolent atonement theory. I like to say nonviolent atonement realism. The next slide, of course, here's the chart.
Well, that's before we go to the next slide, that's one of the things that I really appreciate about your work, Michael, is that you over and over again, you say things like, our theology matters to how we live our lives. The way that we think matters in how we vote, how we live with our families, how we live with our friends, how we live in the church. And so there's this it's just great, I think, how you're able to make all of this so practical, I guess.
Okay, well, thank you.
Why this matters, right?
Yes, it does. So if you go to slide 14, there's the slide you're familiar with on the voices. And this, by the way, I believe is almost identical to the way James sees these things structured. I'm very pleased to have been able to figure this out before James and apart from him. That way I don't have to feel like I depend on everything for his stuff.
There you go.
He is such an incredible and extraordinary thinker.
Yeah, we had him on last week. It was great.
Yeah.
So, am I on the right slide here with Jesus carrying the cross?
Adam, we'll go to slide 15, the one that you put the picture of Jesus and the cross on.
Okay.
Again, you all know this. This is what happens when you take the side of the persecutor. You end up in the language of Caiaphas, seeking a scapegoat. And Jesus is a failed scapegoat. When people say to me, is Jesus a scapegoat? The fact is he's not. He's a failed scapegoat. And that's precisely what makes his story so powerful. And then the next slide, Adam. So if I have to define nonviolent atonement, I put it this way. Nonviolent atonement is a way of conceiving the death of Jesus outside the framework of a sacrificial hermeneutic which places Jesus' death back into the paradigm of archaic sacred violence. The Christianity that follows from this is one oriented to peace and justice, not a tit-for-tat justice, but a justice for the real world of fractured, fragile humans and their tenuous relationships, a justice whose care and concern for the victimized and marginalized in any society is a testimony to the crucified. That's essentially how I define nonviolent atonement, and I think in that I've tried to capture both the need to break from the default position, the new paradigm shift that occurs in real-world terms is what I was trying to capture. So on the last slide, what are the benefits of nonviolent atonement? Well, the benefits are about forgiveness that is freely given. It's not earned. It's freely given. It's the end of economies of exchange, which becomes real key as we begin to unpack all of the implications of this in terms of human relations. It's the end of the satanic persecutory system. It's about restoration, not retribution. It's about liberation from sin and fear of death. There's your Christus Victor. It's about joining Jesus by modeling him through participation in his life by the Spirit. There's your doctrine of the Trinity. And it's about peace and justice. So that will conclude the talk on the slides. And yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
Excellent. I am going to bring the slide down and stop sharing screen, and we can bring people into the chat. Michael, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure it brought up questions for people. It brought up some questions for me as well. So now we are entering a phase of the conversation where we are dependent on our comments or questions for Michael. And so if you have any comments or questions, you can go up to, I think it's the attendees, you have that up there, and unmute yourself, and we can bring you in and you can ask a comment or a question. If you're on the phone, go ahead and unmute yourself and bring yourself in. This might become a little chaotic, and that's okay. We'll just go with it. So as you are doing that, I'll ask Michael a question, and then you can bring yourself in. Well, I'll go with Tim's question here, Michael. Tim says, I was thinking about the current political conflict, how it is so tit for tat and rivalrous.
Yes,
Michael, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, that's an absolutely correct statement. It is the Democrats and the Republicans have become mirror doubles of each other more and more, really since the Reagan administration. And they're both functioning satanically. I think, in fact, what we're seeing here is this growth and undifferentiation in the political world that will require a scapegoat.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that question, Tim. That was excellent. Michael, are you still there?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Kind of went in and out there for a second. So you mentioned that Jesus is a failed scapegoat.
Yes.
Can you say more about how Jesus is a failed scapegoat? How does his scapegoating fail?
There's two pieces to this. The first has to do with the fact that there are women with him around the cross. The all against one mechanism is broken by these women who stand by the suffering victim. They're prominent in the crucifixion scene. They're essential to the crucifixion scene because they're the witnesses that this is not right. And I think that's why they're the first ones to whom the risen Christ appears in the Gospels, in the resurrection narrative. So that's the first piece. Second, the publication of this story includes these witnesses who told others and who created the possibility some, 8 or 9, 10 years later for this passion narrative to form so that 30 years later it would end up being published in textual form. In other words, Jesus is a failed scapegoat precisely because his story is told. The innocent was deemed guilty. We know is not innocent. That text, that passion narrative allows us to see our incredible capacity for self-deception. We went for the fruit in the garden, so to speak, to determine right from wrong. The fact is we've never been able to do that as a species.
That's great. Any questions out there that people may have? You mentioned at the end justice. Justice is always a complicated issue because we often think that justice has to be done through some kind of violence or but you're pointing towards a different kind of justice. Can you say more about justice?
Yes. The entire epistle to the Romans is about this very question. In fact, you know the great Pauline phrase, dikaiosune thau, we translate very poorly as the righteousness of God.
Mm.
It's actually the justification of God. And Paul is seeking to say in Romans, how do you justify a God who freely forgives everybody? By the time you get to the end of Romans 11, Paul has twice concluded, once in chapter 3 and again in Romans 11, that God has placed the entire species, Jew and Gentile alike, under disobedience. There are no good people. There are no bad people. The whole damn thing is placed in the trash can, so to speak. And then it says, and therefore God is justified to forgive everybody. The argument of the epistle to the Romans is, how do you believe in a God who can forgive bad people? Christians have turned this whole thing so upside down, and they've said that God forgives me because I'm basically good, or God forgives me because I have faith, or God forgives me because I'm born again, or God forgives me because I chose Jesus as my Savior, or God forgives me because I'm one of the elect. All of this puts conditions on grace. And Paul has none of that. Grace is grace, and that grace of God is for all.
Yeah, I remember reading N.T. Wright's book on justice, and he says that in chapter 3, there's this almost courtroom-like thing going on, and all of humanity is placed in one place, and God says, you are forgiven.
That's
so there's
right.
like this
That's exactly
excellent, like,
That's
universal aspect to forgiveness within Romans,
Sure.
which is fascinating.
Sure.
Suella has a question. Suella, if you want to hit the cam button up there, you should be able to bring yourself in if you'd like to do that. Or if you just want to ask the question through the mic, that would be fine. There you are. Hi, Suella.
Hi, Suella.
Hello. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about accusation, action, and intention. It went by really fast, and intuitively I thought, yes, that's right, but I have no idea I don't remember what you said.
Okay. I'm not sure I remember what I said either. The Satan is the user, or the accusatory principle. One of the important things that Renee did was to show us how to understand the concept of the Satan through an anthropological rather than a theological lens. So the Satan is the human pointing its finger at another, blaming another. And so I'll tell people, I'll point a finger at him and tell them, that's the ultimate satanic gesture. You did it with my finger pointer. What Jesus does, see, in order for me to accuse you, I have to believe that you meant what you did, that there was malice behind it and forethought, that you meant to hurt me. So I will then proceed to move in the conversation with you with my finger pointed. Jesus doesn't do that on the cross. He decouples our actions from our intentions. He recognizes that how we live is really more or less in a non-conscious world. That's why I used the matrix at the beginning. I mean, literally, we live non-consciously. We think we have a consciousness. We think we have an ego. But our brains are receiving 30,000 bits of data a second. And we are literally living this thing we call consciousness is an extraordinary filter. So I think what Jesus is helping us to see is that we not only barely see the surface of each other, but we barely see the surface of ourselves. And so he decouples action and intention. And that's how Paul can say in 2 Corinthians 5, God was in Christ reconciling the world to God's self, not counting their sins against them, decoupling action and intention. Our entire justice system is predicated on those two together and prove that a person did this on purpose. So when you decouple those, you have a real different kind of justice.
Fascinating.
Very good.
Thank you, Sue Ellen.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Okay. I see my friend Tito from Florida is on. Wonderful.
Tito is on. Jonathan has a question for you.
Okay.
I'm interested in your understanding of life in the Spirit. Is there a point of contact with Pentecostal/charismatic practices and experience?
Oh, absolutely. My largest growing audience this past year has been Pentecostals and Charismatic. In fact, I'm up here at 2 charismatic churches in Edmonton this week having an absolute blast. As I've shared with the 2 pastors I'm with, there are a lot of different types of Pentecostals and Charismatics, and a lot of them have their own particular brand of experience. Often, a lot of that is simply mimetic. People learn so-called spiritual practices by miming those around them. Now, I'm not saying that they're inauthentic at all. What I am saying is that if you go to a Methodist church, you're going to learn certain ways to speak and be. If you go to a Mennonite church, same thing. Catholic church, same thing. In other words, we automatically fit in with the crowd we're in. But that doesn't mean the Spirit isn't moving. One of the great places that I see the Spirit moving right now in the charismatic tradition is what we call the grace preachers. And there is a movement in Pentecostalism away from legalism toward a Girardian hermeneutic. A lot of these folks are actually beginning to read Girard, which is very encouraging.
That's cool.
I know that didn't answer Jeff's question completely, but I really want to honor both the influence of the Spirit and the charismatic tradition, but recognize as well from a Girardian perspective that we're often dealing in environments like this with a lot of mimetists. So, yeah.
Kathy has a question. Kathy, I've unmuted you. If you want to hit the cam button and bring yourself up, that'd be great. If not, that's fine.
Yeah, and I see Kathy's question.
There she is.
Yeah, I'm just referring, Michael, to, you mentioned it as part of your slideshow, and I think I don't know enough of the nuances of Girard's previous or old way of looking at sacrificial violence and the new way. So
yeah.
I'm just
you bring up a great point. You wrote that you think Girard changed his mind after discussions with Schwager. That is no longer just opinion, that is fact. The Girard-Schwager letters that are being translated and will be published, I believe, next year at some point. In those letters, already back in the the early 80s, after Things Hidden had been published in 78, after Must There Be Scapegoats had been published in 78. And here's the thing. Both Girard and Schwager, even though they will meet and they will have a correspondence after Violence in the Sacred is published in 72, they will both independently take the thesis of Violence in the Sacred and use it to interpret the scriptures. Girard does that in Things Hidden. Schwager does it in Must There Be Scapegoats. Although Girard's reading of the biblical text in the second part of Things Hidden is absolutely brilliant, Schwager does a much better job of laying out a paradigm for what's happening. So they do this independently of each other. And one of the things that Schwager asked Renee early on in the correspondence is he says, I think you're kind of scapegoating sacrifice. And Renee hasn't been able to figure his way out of the Epistle to the Hebrews. And so Schwager has one letter where he kind of works through the logic of the Epistle to the Hebrews and how it's changing to self-sacrifice. And over the years, that will become part of Renee's thought. I know that an essay that I wrote back in the early 90s on Hebrews also, Renee said, helped him begin to see this shift. And by the time you get to evolution and conversion, which is kind of a looking back at things hidden and the changes that have occurred in 25 years, Renee said,
Yeah.
I scapegoated the word sacrifice, you know, and what he's really trying to do is differentiate between sacrifice, which is taking the life of another, and self-offering, which is not about taking your own life, but about giving yourself away. But he couldn't see that distinction early on.
I see. That helps a lot.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank
Schwager was the most incredible human being. I mean, he was so gentle and so nice and kind and had time for everybody. He was wonderful. I miss him.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions? Questions about maybe the upcoming lectionary text or anything like that? More questions about Michael's presentation? Matthew McNatt, I will unmute you and you bring yourself in. Hi, Matthew.
Hello.
Hi, Matthew.
If you want to hit the cam button up there, there you go.
Michael, do retribution, that is being compelled to pay commemorative payments or make tribute, or restitution, returning things harmed to a state of wholeness, or discipline, the application of whatever energy is necessary to bring a person into obedience, do they have a place in your understanding of the atonement? Because it seems to me that each of those is a force applied to a will with the understanding that that we do have a consciousness, and that our intention and action can sometimes be coupled, even though they may not necessarily be.
For me, restitution is definitely a part of my understanding of the atonement. That is, Jesus, as the second Adam, is restoring everything to the way it was meant to be. I saw a great bumper sticker that God's original plan A was to hang about naked in a garden with a bunch of vegans. Now, I don't know if it's that kind of restitution, but definitely about restoring wholeness. The problem I have with retribution, or the concept of retribution, or the use of the term discipline as you defined it in your parenthesis here, is that both of them seem to me to be embedded in an economy of exchange, a do ut des. I give in order to receive. And I think it's precisely the logic of an economy of exchange that the New Testament writers, for the most part, not all of them, but most of them, the great writers, Paul, the writer of Mark, the writer of Luke, the writer of John, the writer of Hebrews, they're all seeking to deconstruct. We do have another trajectory in the New Testament, a trajectory that begins to interpret the death of Jesus in terms of an economy of exchange. Matthew does it. I believe you find it in the Revelation. I believe you find it in the little letter to Jude. I suspect 2 Peter may be there. I'm not persuaded one way or the other yet on the pastorals. But I think we have two distinct trajectories in the New Testament. One that takes the gospel and is already beginning to turn it back toward what Girard calls myth, and another that's opening up the gospel as gospel. I think they're both necessary in the New Testament, just as both myth and gospel are necessary in the Old Testament. So I don't have a supersessionist theory where the New Testament trumps the Old Testament, but where we see more myth and some gospel in the Old Testament, we see more gospel but some myth-making happening in the New Testament, which explains how Christianity could ultimately become a sacrificial religion by taking both the sacrificial theory that one finds in the false teachers that one, I think you could make a case for, finds behind the Gospel of Matthew, behind the Jerusalem church, and you have this other trajectory. They're both necessary. So I don't want to go to the Bible and say, well, what does the Bible teach? The Bible teaches a bunch of things, and part of what the Bible teaches is how not to do theology, and part of what the Bible teaches is how to do it. I don't know if that answers your question.
it does if retribution or restitution or discipline is solely for the sake of the other. But it seems to me that there are many times where making a commemorative payment, which I think might be how one way to understand the Sabbath keeping for the Israelites, or putting a graveside marker or decorating that each year at the site of a drunk driving accident, that those sort of things, even when compelled, can often be transformative for the people who are doing them, not just for the sake of the people who were harmed or the loss that occurred.
Oh, I have no doubt about that. I would place that in the category of restitution, restoring things to a state of wholeness. Because that's what's happening, the transformation of being able to grieve and deal with the grief. For example, at the site of a DUI, you're placing flowers, you're remembering, you're feeling the feelings. But as you do this year by year, you're also letting them go, and life moves on, and you know. So I would think that's more restitution. When I think of retribution, retributing, I'm thinking specifically of that principle do ut des, that God requires something before God can be gracious. You have to put a nickel in God's machine and pull the lever in order for God to be nice to you, whether that's faith, whether that's attendance at church, whether that's keeping the law, whatever it is, you got to put that nickel in order to get God to like you. I just don't see that as the message of the gospel.
Do you see obedience as obedience to a covenant as being key to being a part of that covenant? And again, I think that same phrase that you mentioned, or that idea that God requires something, the requirement to put the flowers by the graves by the accident site is definitely required, and it's required in order to get a particular outcome, not to earn that outcome, but to get it.
Yeah, but who requires it? The dead person doesn't require it. God doesn't require it. It's the person placing the flowers that says, I need to do this. I need to do this for me. There's no transaction taking place between the self and the self.
I suppose if it's a judge that requires it, that would make it retribution versus just tribute, but voluntary tribute.
It would make it retribution, and at that point you have to begin to ask: is the person that's really putting the flowers there making an amends in their heart? We would never know. We just wouldn't know. So, I mean, that's a difficult question. You asked me about obedience and covenants. I am not at all a fan of the Reformed tradition and its emphasis on covenants. I think that is a misreading of the emphasis in Scripture. Obedience, I believe, is, comes from the Latin ob audire, to hear out. And I think when we hear the voice of Jesus and we listen, we are literally hearing out His life in our life. It's not about the rules and regulations or the laws or the do's and the don'ts that our culture puts on us or our church puts on us. And I often get people coming to me and saying, can I do this or can I do that? And I think to myself, what a sad world they live in when their whole life is oriented to trying to figure out right from wrong, instead of recognizing that Christ is the end of the law. It's over. It's over and done with. There is no more accusatory instrument. There's nothing that says, Matt, you did this right, or Matt, you did that wrong. It doesn't exist in God's frame. That's still part of our frame, but not God's frame. So I never worry about being obedient or disobedient. I only worry about whether I'm listening. And I ask all the time in my prayers, Papa, make my ears open. That's just what I need for today. And and then I let it take its course.
So I'll make this my final comment, and then close my cam. But I'm hearing a juxtaposition between retribution and restitution. And I'm thinking of, I mean, when I hold my child and I kiss my little daughter, and I kiss her not just because I love her, but I kiss her in order to love her. And I think of the requirements that I have that she sit down at the dinner table. And it is a requirement that the family is around the dinner table. And as a caring father, I enforce those requirements. And it's not that she has that by being at the dinner table she earns my favor, but by being at the dinner table she does come to know my favor in a way that she wouldn't otherwise. And we develop a relationship that we wouldn't if I simply said whatever you want to do.
That's possible. I mean, you can do that. I don't know how old your daughter is, but
Just 3.
Is she a teenager? Huh?
She's 3.
Wait till she becomes a teenager. That won't work anymore. I know I've had 3 teenage daughters, and now I have 2 teenage granddaughters. They will tell you, I'm not hungry, or I'm not interested, or they'll sit there sullen. I mean, this will work for a while, but wait till they're teenagers. I guess I'm looking at the chat bar and the questions, and Adam disappeared.
Whoa, what happened? Yeah, you may have noticed that I disappeared. Other people have been raptured in any meeting, but I never have been. This was my first time, and it was weird. I don't know what the deal was, but Pathio says it's probably something to do with my computer and that I need to restart it or something, and we'll see if that helps out. Fortunately, we were at the end of our conversation. Okay, despite the technical difficulties, that was a lot of fun, and thank you to Michael Hardin for guiding us through that presentation and having a discussion with us afterwards. Next Thursday, we are going to talk with our friend Paul about the lectionary and his website, the Girardian Lectionary. After that, we're going to have an open chat, which will be open for topics, so send in any topics that you want to talk about. And then the week after that, we're going to talk with David Dawson about his book, Flesh Becomes Word. I've got it right here. Flesh Becomes Word, a lexicography of the scapegoat or the history of an idea. Fascinating book, highly recommend it, and join us then and next week with Paul. All right, bye-bye.